and the association of both programs to high-level Mason members has been repeated many times. Many of the personalities involved in the original MKUltra experiments were high-level Masons, including Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, Dr. George Estabrooks, Dr. Ewan Cameron.
How were you chosen to be in the MKUltra program? Glenn Lewis wants to know.
I was chosen to be in it because I was born into a multi-generational incest-based family. My father had been sexually abused and ritually abused. My mother had been sexually abused. My grandfather ran a Blue Masonic Lodge. And so the multi-generational aspect of that abuse being passed down from generation to generation meant that I would be born more compliant and easily led. So that's what ultimately made me a target for MKUltra mind control. So my father's sexual abuse of me extended into child pornography. He was trafficking me to my grandfather's Blue Masonic Lodge, to the politicians there. I was targeted because I was born into a multi-generational incest-based family. And the Hitler-Himmler research had proven that that would make me a prime candidate or a chosen one for the MKUltra program. When you have multi-generational trauma, after 3 generations, it starts to become autogenic. And one strong factor for that example would be pedophilia. When a child is abused prior to age 5 while their brain is still forming, the brain automatically compartmentalizes that event so the rest of the mind can function normally. The Masonic lodges were a secret society where they had the secrets on mind control and the effects of trauma on the human mind. And they would place people in certain key positions in society. I think it's pretty well understood that if someone was Mason, they would get the good job, you know, or whatever in local communities, local law enforcement, local politicians, they were part of that Masonic Lodge. And Ford, because he knew those secrets, because he was involved in MKUltra mind control.
Between the years of 1957 and 1984, I became a pawn in a government scheme whose ultimate goal was mind control and to create the perfect spy, all through the use of chemicals, radiation, drugs, hypnosis, electric shock, isolation in tubs of water, sleep deprivation, brainwashing, verbal, physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. I was exploited unwittingly for nearly 3 decades of my life, and the only explanations given to me were that, quote, the end justifies the means, and, quote, I was serving my country in their bold effort to fight communism. I can only summarize my circumstances by saying they took an already abused 7-year-old child and compounded my suffering beyond belief. The saddest part is, I know for a fact that I was not alone. There were countless other children in my same situation, and there was no one to help us until now.
Did you feel that the doctors were deliberately creating dissociation with you?
Yes, they knew that I could dissociate from the beginning, so they just caused me to dissociate even more, because the more you split, the easier it was to hide what they were doing. In other words, you can only split, they can't make you split. They can't make you dissociate. But they can create the circumstances that they know you will, if you're able to dissociate, you'll do it. Like the trauma I just described, like sending me out to a Masonic lodge for a party. They would send me out and You knew something horrible was going to happen. I mean, they knew something horrible was going to happen to me. They knew that I would split, that someone would be created just to take whatever happened that night. And probably that's all they would do. And then they would go back and, go to sleep, become dormant. And these are the shadows that I was talking about that have integrated. Once they gave me the memory of, say, that experience, then they integrate. But so they create circumstances to make you split and split and split. And the more you split, of course, the less chance you have of ever healing. The more crazy you're going to sound if you ever do go to a psychiatrist or a therapist, because there was always that chance that I might get away from them and seek help from someone other than the good doctors that I knew already. There was always that chance, so they had to make you seem as crazy as possible. And of course, the more alters you have, the more bizarre you're going to seem to people. I would remember first the incest stuff, the stuff at home, and then it would gradually go from that to the ritual stuff. I went to a couple of Masonic parties at a lodge that was located right near the research building. There was a research building for animal experiments in New Orleans, and it's still there, as a matter of fact. I've been back there, and they sent me there sometimes for certain tests or for experiments. And there was a Masonic lodge right around the corner from it, and they sent me to a couple of parties there. And these people they go crazy at these parties. And these men, they just get drunk and, they just pass you around, and it's horrible what they do.
Was it sexual abuse that was going on, or other kinds of abuse at these parties?
Yes. They'd make you perform sexually. They'd make you watch other people perform. I mean, they would have everything you can imagine, even bringing in the animals. And you had to watch, it's just as bad as having it done to yourself. Sometimes watching is just as worse. I mean, just as bad.
Watching it being done to other people. Children? Or
yeah, especially if it's people younger than yourself. You're a child, and you have to stand there and watch a little kid who's half your age being tortured or raped or whatever. I mean, that's just as bad as having it done to yourself.
And when you remembered this lodge, did you make attempts to verify if it was where it was? And
yeah, we went there.
Mm-hmm.
We went to the lodge and talked to people. It's not a lodge anymore. It's a public health building, actually, now. But yeah, we talked to people that had been there, and they said, yeah, it was a Masonic lodge at one time. So Valerie and I went there. We went to Camp Nichols.
Police say they broke up a drug-fueled sex party at the Masonic Temple in Battle Creek. Our sources described the scene as out of control, and they did arrest people.
Police sources told us the first officer to walk inside was shocked to find a couple performing a lewd sex act right in front of him, along with multiple nude women, drugs, and men videotaping it all behind these closed doors.
Now, I know you've spoken about the involvement of the Masonic Lodge or some members of the Masonic Lodge involved in or being allegations towards them of being perpetrators of ritual abuse. Can you talk about how you first received this information?
Well, early on in my research, when people were coming forward with accounts, some accounts appeared about deviant Freemasons. That is to say, some of the people making allegations were indicating that their fathers had been Freemasons, and that somehow their alleged abuse they thought was connected with the lodge or Freemasons. Occasionally, abuse accounts if they were true, and I can't say that they were definitively, but if they were true, seem to have occurred inside Masonic lodges.
I remember lots of strange abuse happening at these strange gatherings, almost like parties for them.
And how old were you?
Below the age of 12.
As a child, I also experienced ritual abuse at camp. It sounds implausible because it was designed by the abusers to sound implausible. In my experience, these abusers specifically choose to do things that are unbelievable so that the children they do it to are not believed. So do you have other memories of experiences at this Masonic lodge in Surbiton?
Yeah, I also had memory of like a children's paddling pool, and then I was hanging by one leg lowered into the water and my head smashed against the floor. It caused a lot of confusion. Yeah.
We met a few years ago, and through that friendship, we've discussed the abuse that we experienced both in our family homes, but also by groups in the UK. And what I find most interesting and disturbing about that particular form of abuse, it's a known practice by these groups because it disorientates and confuses a child. Then to combine it with near drowning, which is another well-known ritual abuse technique. And again, people might think, that sounds wild, this ritual abuse concept sounds ridiculous, I don't believe in that. Well, actually, the US government used the same method. They call it waterboarding. What is most shocking and disturbing about that particular memory for you is that almost exactly the same thing was done to me by a different group in England in an entirely different location. I find that very, very upsetting because it suggests to me that these practices are both widespread and formulaic. They're designed, someone's designed these specific processes to traumatize and then compartmentalize children so that they are subjected to torture, they're programmed, and then they're unable to recall that programming because part of themselves that were subjected to it is split.
Yeah. On the same topic of drowning and spinning, other things happened with this Masonic group in this other location. And I also remember being taken there one evening with other children, going into the pool, swimming pool there. Another drowning exercise was performed on me, so threw me into the pool. I was tied up and my dad saved me to make the connection of him as like a trusted person, even though he was the one perpetrating the abuse.
Yeah, again, this is a known abuse technique. If listeners are curious in researching these ritual abuse techniques, you'll find that there's a whole selection of different things that abusers do to condition responses, particularly fear responses in those they abuse, and also to create a dependency. And that's where you subject a child to extreme torture and then you save them. And then you create what's called essentially a double bind. So the person who's tortured you has now saved you, and you feel a strange and deep allegiance to that person because they have saved you. But the contradictory piece of information is they put you in the position where you were almost killed. This is often used in conjunction with drowning. So often abusers will near drown someone and then will rescue them at the last moment. I mean, this is known more broadly as like Stockholm syndrome, where essentially someone starts sympathizing with their captors or their abusers. But this is a more acute version of that, where it's not simply an empathy with the abuser through proximity, but where the abuser actively tortures someone, then apparently saves them from that torture. And as a result, creates a very strange and deep and unsettling allegiance where you feel like your saviour is also your torturer. This is a well-trodden method of manipulating people. And again, it might sound like new information to many listeners. I would suggest that's because many powerful individuals wish you to remain ignorant of what is done.
And I mean, on the theme of drowning, one evening a group of other men took me to the River Thames in Richmond along the riverbank and just dropped me in the water. So I don't think there was any attempt there. I don't think they had any attempt of wanting me to survive that. So I just remember sinking down to the bottom of the water, going into quite a timeless state, and being there, it felt like an eternity. concept of time gets very distorted there. And I just remember at one point, like feeling like there was a choice there whether I wanted to stay alive or whether I wanted to die. But it seemed very peaceful on the other side, and everything seemed much more peaceful than existence in this earth. Yeah, and I don't know how. I mean, I think if you're in this kind of emergency near-death experience, I think somehow you just have powers that you don't normally have, and just managed to get rid of the rope on my foot and swam back to the surface. And I feel like it was a big shock for the men in this cult, and especially to my father. I think everyone thought that I was going to die and that they just got rid of me now, but they hadn't got rid of me. And I came back to the surface, and there was my dad, and then he just threw me back into the water and then raped me in the water. So that now I just have a horrible memory of being abused again in the water, and then also having pictures taken on the riverbank, and a white night dress. I was only about 7 again.
Did you feel like at the time there was anyone you could talk to about what was happening?
No.
Did you feel like you could go to the police?
No.
Why was that?
Because I was abused by a police officer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, again, because if I told anyone...
Because people don't want to believe that authority
extreme.
is so corrupt and that people can abuse people in such extreme ways. So you were raped by a police officer, and this was after an experience of being prostituted as a child, and this was also in Richmond in London, I believe, because you've talked to me about this before, but it was an experience that took place above a shop in Richmond.
I remember being taken there when I was a child by my father, of course, and prostituted. There were loads of little girls and boys being undressed, putting like a dog chain around their necks and led into small, disgusting rooms where sick people would come and pay.
This is on the floor above the Russell and Bromley shoe shop in Richmond. Your observation was that a group there was prostituting children.
Yeah.
And that people were entering the space, adults were entering the space and paying to abuse children in rooms. But you sensed the abuse was ongoing, and this place was... It
felt like my father took me there to make money from me. There were other parents who would just take their children there to make money.
It's not really your responsibility to answer this question, but I wonder if you had any feelings about why it was that parents would be doing that to their children.
I feel like they're sick and they have no empathy, and they just completely focused on money and power. I think more deeper reason is that they've probably been through the same conditioning when they were children, and that they've been so extremely abused that they have no recollection of how it felt like to be abused like that. So they're just repeating this abuse onto the next generation. But I think because they've completely detached themselves from the feelings of being a small child and completely identified with being an abuser.
So after you had the experience of being prostituted with other children in the space above the shoe shop in Richmond, what happened?
My father took me and another little boy who was also being prostituted there down back steps, down an alleyway, and took us to the police station. Basically pretended that the little boy was lost. It seemed like some big club, some network that they were all part of. Seemed very friendly and familiar with the police officer, and then the police officer took us both and abused us, and then made the little boy abuse me through his hands. So yeah.
you were prostituted, your father then took you to a police station where you were then abused by a police officer that he seemed to have some foreknowledge of. They seem to be part of the same group. Yeah, I think at this point it's interesting for me to say, and I advise listeners to do their own research into this. There was a survey made of the British police force a few years ago, and the survey asked the question, are you a member of the Freemasons? And 2/3 of those police officers refused to answer the question. 2/3 of those police officers refused to answer the question.
I guess that's some indication of how many are. Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's definitely a network of these abusive groups. There's also the Freemasons Lodge Brighton, and I also have other memories in Brighton and other institutions, a bed and breakfast, a fish and chip shop, where there was also abuse happening. I feel like there are internet groups or places where people involved in child abuse are able to seek out locations in different towns to be able to abuse children.
You felt through your experiences of being abused at these different locations that there was a network, that there was an organised group.
There were just so many different locations.
So there were 3 different locations that were Masonic temples and Masonic lodges.
There was the one in Surbiton, there was the one in Brighton, and there was the big lodge in London, in the centre of London, where I had another memory which was very extreme. Yeah.
Okay. Would you be okay describing what happened in the lodge in central London?
But it's very central in London. I think it's the most central lodge, the biggest one. There was a ceremony happening. There were little boys actually, mainly, and me, and they were all wearing their long, stupid costumes. There was a ceremony, drinking blood. There was sacrificial animal on an altar at the front. The worst thing about the ceremony was that there was actually a sacrifice that happened. They basically wanted all the children to come up, basically put a knife in this poor little boy's heart and kill him. I just remember being in this line, and then as soon as I got to the altar, I just ran away. I hid under a bench shaking, and I just kept hiding and protesting, and they'd try and drag me back there, and I'd kick and scream, and I wouldn't participate. I just remember seeing that. And because he had done nothing wrong. But I'm glad he could go to a safer place.
Sure, he feels that you're very strong for speaking out about what you saw happen to him. Most people never speak out about what they've seen, so thank you.
Yeah.
Why do you feel that they made all the children stab this boy?
I think they wanted to really confuse children, and I still have this confusion now a lot of the time, and that they want to make you feel guilty, and they want to make you feel like you were the one that was doing the abuse. They want to put all the guilt and all the feelings that the abusers feel onto you, so that you feel scared to ever speak out, because once it's hard enough going through the abuse that they subject you to, but then if you suddenly are made to participate in something that you absolutely would never want to do, you feel responsible, and you feel like, oh my goodness, I'm turning into an abuser. Why I would never want to do this, but I've done something that I would never want to do. And I think it creates a lot of doubt, prevents you from speaking out, because you feel like you're becoming an abuser.
That's been my understanding of it as well. They call it forced participation, where essentially an abusive group forces those they're abusing to participate. in the abuse, often as children, and often involves sacrifice in different forms. We can see it in war with child soldiers. Boy soldiers are enlisted at a very young age into groups in some countries. Then they're trained to kill, essentially ritual abuse, where they're disconnected from their emotions and their humanity. And then they participate at a very young age in the murder of other humans.
Also, on the same day during this ceremony, the Masons would pair off with the little boys and me, go to different rooms behind the main altar in the back building and be raped and abused. My uncle, who was also there, he was the one who took me into a room and raped me. That was pretty normal, yeah.
So your uncle was participating in the organisation as well?
Yeah.
And he had been abusing you outside of the Masonic lodge at other times?
Yeah.
Yeah. So both your father and your uncle were part of the Freemasons organisation, and they would supply you to other members of the Freemasons who would abuse you and force you to participate in rituals which included the murder of a child.
Yeah.
Would like to say that, again, this is something that's not unusual in these ritual groups. They use these methods specifically to confuse, disorientate, and split children.
Yeah. Just remember on another occasion being in a graveyard, and I had made friends with a little cat that lived in the graveyard. It was a little Wilbur cat, and it was black, and yeah, and I loved the little Wilbur cat, and we were friends, and the cat Wilbur was kept in cages all the time, and at one point my father forced my hand to kill Wilbur, and of course it's not something that I would ever want to do. Like, I loved Wilbur, but I mean, he stood behind me and forced my hand to kill her, so he killed her through me.
And this is another known ritual abuse technique, that the abusers will encourage a child to befriend an animal or another child, and then they will force that child to kill the animal or child that they befriended, specifically because this breaks a very deep bond. And it was done to me. So I know the experience and I know the technique very well. It's not done offhand. It's not been dreamt up on the spot. But to create a situation where a child befriends and deeply loves another being, whether that's a cat or another child, and then to force that child to kill that other being, creates such a deep wound and such a deep conflict in the child. The sense of guilt and confusion is overwhelming because the child feels responsible and the child is told that they're responsible. And again, for me, it felt very organised. It didn't feel like this was a random group of people casually acting out some weird abuse they weren't fully conscious of having experienced themselves. It felt like it was designed. It felt like it was well organised and designed. And your experiences seem to echo that. It's interesting to note how many of your experiences involved the Freemasons and these Masonic groups.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you would say to other survivors who might be listening, who feel like it's difficult, if not impossible, to speak out?
I've sort of realised for myself that I think, the law enforcement and any form of power in most countries is so corrupt that I don't really trust these organisations. I feel like it's so worthwhile to remember and to speak out, because there is a higher form of justice, and I just feel like, I mean, for the sake of those children that lost their lives and just for the sake of good. Because it's something that you can feel in your heart. There's always a difference between the feelings that they create in you by making you commit acts like murder or things that you would never do. You feel bad and you feel guilty and you're responsible, but when you actually listen to your heart, that's your true self, and then you know that you would never do something like that. And I think it's just important to trust that side of this. That's your true nature.
Yeah, I would tell those survivors like me and you that it is okay to speak out, that many of us are speaking out. You maybe don't hear our voices as much or as loudly, because a lot of the ways in which we might reach you through television or radio or newspapers are owned by very rich organisations who have a vested interest in this information not reaching you. But don't be confused, there are many of us out here, and there are many of us speaking out. And if you want to speak out, then do. There's enough of us doing it now for there to be strength in numbers. At this point, I'd like to say thank you to our listeners. If you've made it this far, then you've been very brave, because this is a very difficult topic to hear about. Because most people do not want to know what power and authority does to retain power and authority. They do not want to know what happens to children, because many of them had the same experiences or similar experiences. They do not want to reflect or remember that, because it's extremely painful. It's also extremely difficult to remember. Our society does not support the remembering process. Our society supports the forgetting process. So I want to thank you, friend, for everything you've spoken about today, and for your strength and for your courage.